Thank you. I know Danny mentioned earlier that it was important that he got new jokes, and giving me a kind introduction, I guess, is what he had in mind. So I appreciate it nonetheless. I had a few jokes that I was about to give, but about 5 minutes ago, I got the news that Pastor James Coates had his bail appeal denied this morning and remains in jail until May. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I also hate lying even more. And we are in a time where we've got a lot of bad news to give. And in a lot of ways, this actually ties in with what I wanted to talk about, which is changing the culture. Conservatives have historically focused so much on institutions and elections. We had 10 years in which Stephen Harper was the prime minister. He had, for the last 4 years of that, a majority government. He stacked the court. He stacked the Senate. He stacked the boards of everyone from the CBC to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And would we say that the legacy of that has been on side with what people on the right in Canada want? It hasn't. And that isn't to cast negative judgment on the Stephen Harper government. It's actually to look forward, which is that Conservatives have to stop looking at the immediate results of elections and board positions and all of these and start to look at the longer-term cultural implications. Now, I will say, following what John Robson pointed out, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not one or the other. It's both. But you can't ignore the culture. And that's what I wanted to talk about this morning. John Robson laid out some absolutely phenomenal ideas for how you need to have a clear position. What I wanted to speak about this morning is the importance of having a cultural ground that's laid so that it is no longer cancelable, to use the terms of the era, to take the positions that are in alignment with what a lot of the people watching this believe. And I'll talk about a few different contexts of this. Guns, lockdowns, and independence. Two of the three I happen to like. I won't tell you which two, but you should be able to figure it out. All of them have to do with freedom. But at a more fundamental level, all of them are areas in which the culture is stacked against a lot of the people who value freedom. Firearms rights in Canada, insofar as they exist, there's another joke, I guess. Firearms rights in Canada are under attack. Property rights are an extension of that, and it's a discussion that no one in Canada has. And to talk about the referendum ideas that John was putting forward, that's one that I would put on the list, about ensuring that property rights are at the center in a constitutional setting, either in a future Alberta independent government or even at the Canadian government level, complicated as it is to change the Canadian Constitution. But the problem right now is that we have seen a culture in which taking a position that supports the right to own guns, taking a position that opposes lockdowns, taking a position that supports independence, has not just been cast as a minority position, which there's nothing wrong with. It's been cast as an egregious fringe position. Now, I think that if you were to talk to a lot of people, certainly in the West, you'd find that these may actually not just be not fringe, but actually be majority positions. If you talk to real people, with no offense intended to the few politicians that we have with us, I don't think there are a lot of real people in the political process. And certainly from my perspective as someone in media, I don't think there are a lot of real people in media. And some of this is not malicious. Some of it is based on people's own upbringings and experiences. If you grew up in Toronto and you went to the University of Toronto and you get a job in a Toronto newsroom, you may not have even met an Albertan in your life, let alone met an Albertan who believes in Alberta independence or who understands what it is that the West is not getting right now in the Canadian Confederation. As I talked about, I think at my very first time speaking at the Freedom Talk conference, the idea of guns. You get reporters in cities that are writing about guns who have never seen a gun, never been around a gun. They don't know anything about them. And they're the ones that are responsible in a very significant way to tell the story of these things to the general population, who then forms an opinion on them and who then rewards politicians that want to go after guns. And all of these issues are interconnected. And I know in a lot of ways people can say, well, you're preaching to the choir, but I want to talk about the way that we present what it is that we value, the way we present what it is that we care about. Margaret Thatcher had a fantastic line that I think has withstood the test of time, which is that first you win the argument, then you win the vote. And the problem with this is that the nature of the political process is that every party is in power until it isn't. And even the Alberta PCs is a great example. I know a lot of big fans of them in the room and watching this. They were in power and everyone thought, well, it was just this dynastic effect. They were going to be there forever. But even the Alberta PCs were there until they weren't. At the federal level, the push and pull between liberal conservative is even more noticeable. It is impossible to build something long-lasting in a political setting, in an elected office setting, if someone else is going to be around in 4 years or 8 years who can dismantle it. To go back to firearms, Stephen Harper rolled back the long gun registry. Hurrah! And what's happening now? Not a long gun registry, but a major ban on 1,500 types of firearms put in effect by an order in council. And now Bill C-21, a bill that is going forward that is going after law-abiding gun owners and allowing municipal governments powers to ban handguns. You can celebrate the repeal of the long gun registry, but that only lasts as long as there is a government in power that is committed to that course of action. The Conservatives also had a great success in repealing Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. This is the section that allowed the government to go after bloggers, basically, people who committed the egregious sin of saying mean things online. And we thought, great, free speech activists rejoiced. I was part of that. And what happens? You fast forward a few years, you have a government that is bringing back a supercharged version of it that basically deputizes big tech companies to censor on the government's behalf. So these little victories are good. We shouldn't turn them down. We shouldn't vote down politicians who are promising them. But they don't mean anything if the culture itself is not on side. And there needs to be a ground laid so that when politicians do speak up on these issues, it does not become toxic. And I want to talk just as an interesting example of this about travel. So I hail from the province of Ontario. Hold your applause. And we had a couple of months ago, the finance minister of Ontario, Rod Phillips, decide that, well, his government was locking down businesses, closing down restaurants, telling people not to travel. He wanted to spend Christmas in St. Bart's. Now, I don't blame him. I would love to, having experienced the depths of the Ontario winter, to spend Christmas in St. Bart's. He came back and he was subsequently fired from cabinet. Now, Alberta, we found out, had virtually half of the Alberta government in Hawaii, I think, at one point. And Jason Kenney said, you know what? I didn't lay out clear enough expectations. I'm not going to get rid of these people. I want them all to come back, but they're going to keep their jobs. It was just a few days later before that wasn't going to cut it. The facts hadn't changed. The circumstances hadn't changed. But the culture was not on side with what he had said. The culture was not on side with MLAs traveling. So they got kicked out. Staffers had to resign and ministers out of cabinet. And that's a very small example about however cynical we are, politicians are still and governments are still responsive to the culture. Now, we would say not nearly enough in a lot of ways. We would say they're not nearly responsive enough. But this is where you get to that push and pull between government and media, and specifically conservatism and media. And in a lot of ways, despite the growth of independent media, it's very difficult for anyone to break through the mainstream media bubble. A lot of people, even people that believe in values of freedom and liberty and faith and family, they still get their morning newspaper. And that still is their conduit into the world in a lot of ways. Even people that are skeptical of the media are still consumers of the media. And I would say that we should be consumers of it. I'll read things on the left, I'll read things on the right, and I think that's absolutely what we need. We can't wall ourselves off from the world in this way. But the mainstream media still has a stranglehold on a lot of the information that gets out. And more importantly, this is what people don't realize, they are an agenda setter as well. They don't just talk about the issues they want to talk about, but they frame the debate. One of the great things that we see in media, and I use great in a very loose sense, is people say. People say X and Y. And sure, someone out there might be saying anything. There was another great Margaret Thatcher line, and to be honest, I should have actually brought the clip here, but I was trying to keep it simple for the AV team. She was doing an interview with someone, and he had come from Australia, and he said, well, people say that your government is XYZ. And she said, well, who? She said, well, people we've talked to. Well, who? Give me names. And he said, well, people on the street. She's like, I thought you guys just came from the airport. And you know what? There is a lot of truth to that idea. How often do politicians push back against that? So often, especially people on the right, will accept the premise. And you look at John O'Sullivan's first law, and in fact, as I've heard from John himself, his only law, is that any institution that is not explicitly right-wing will over time become left-wing. And when I first learned of that, I was hard-pressed to come up with a single example that contradicted it. Even organizations that say they are explicitly right-wing tend to get pulled to the left many times. But any institution that is not explicitly and expressly committed to upholding certain values of individuality and independence and liberty will eventually drift leftward. And that means that for the left, if they do nothing, they win. And this is, I think, the biggest thing that the right needs to realize. You can never, ever rest on your laurels. On independence, on freedom, on free speech, on taxes. You can never do it because the left knows that the culture is moving in its direction and they could just sit down and eventually it will meet them. And this is, I guess, the problem, is that we need to start playing the game by their rules until the game has changed and the rule book's changed more to our side. And one of the ways we do that, as I've talked about in the past, but I think need to remind everyone, is through independent media. Anyone who has ever criticized the mainstream media, anyone who's ever decried the scourge of fake news, anyone who's ever said, well, these reporters don't get it, I ask you, what have you done to support the alternatives? And in some cases, it's financially. In other cases, it's simply by not being afraid to share it. I can't count the number of times that I've shared a story, a friend of mine has shared a story, and then curiously they delete it later because someone in their circle said, oh, well, you can't share that Andrew Lawton guy. Which, in fairness, is probably good advice. But at the end of the day, people need to be prepared to take a stand. And it's not just about, well, thank you. Thank you, Danny. Jordan Peterson had said, we're all going to get punished. We're going to get punished for speaking up, and we're going to get punished for not speaking up. So the question is, which punishment do you prefer? And myopic as it may be, there is a lot of truth to that idea that if we do nothing, we know that we're not going to like the world that we're left with. So what do we do, and how do we do it? The referendum is key. And I think that the referendum will show something very significant, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, things that the media and the political elites try to frame as being fringe minority positions are not actually that at all. And that's why I think in a lot of cases, questions like the clear, concise questions John put forward are hugely important. Because if there is a clear mandate, no one can say, well, those are just a few angry Albertans. To which I would say, can you blame them? I don't take issue with the angry, I take issue with the few. So what is the way forward? Have the referendum, yes. But let's also start talking about the impetus that we put behind these issues in the culture, in the cultural landscape. I want to tell another story from Ontario, if I may, because it's actually been quite an eventful province politically on these issues. We had some of the major lockdown battles in Ontario. And there have been two MPPs, which is the Ontario equivalent of MLA, Belinda Carajalios and Roman Baber, who have been kicked out of their party's caucus for opposing lockdowns. And I should say their party is the governing Conservative Party. The party in which I stood as a candidate, I should say, in the last election in 2018. And the message was open for business. In fact, that was actually the sign that Premier Doug Ford put at the Ontario border crossing not long after he took office, open for business. Probably check if it's still there. And I think that, again, the Ford government did a lot of good in its first couple of years. But when the chips have been on the table, Ontario and other governments as well across the province or across the country, including in Quebec especially, have chosen the easy path, which is to shut down everything and to ignore the science that they said was supposed to be guiding every single decision. And I don't want to make this about the lockdown debate because there's so much about that already. And I think this is very specific about Alberta independence. But I think that the lockdown dialogue is a very good proxy for Western alienation and Western independence. Because you have something that's growing that is not a left-right battle anymore. And I realize, even in my own remarks today, I've fallen into talking to this because I realize I am on the right and I'm talking to an audience of people who are predominantly on the right as well. But it's moving beyond liberals versus conservatives. And I'm seeing more and more opposition to lockdowns from people who are completely apolitical or people who are even on the left. It's not just conservatives who have been put out of work. It's people on the left. It's union leaders. It's family-owned businesses. It's mom-and-pop shops. It's ordinary people. Students. I mean, university students. Not exactly the bastion of conservatism, even in Alberta, I'm sad to say. But they are as well finding that they are all being locked down, and it's not making sense. It's not keeping with the evidence. It's not matching what they want. But why is that the prevailing position? Why is that the prevailing narrative in the media, that that is what people want? This week, a Conservative member of Parliament, David Sweet, who is also, I'm sorry to be so Ontario-centric, that's been where the news has been on a lot of these things. David Sweet joined that MPP I just mentioned, Roman Baber, and criticized lockdowns. And his party leader, Aaron O'Toole, issued a statement saying, well, he gets why people are frustrated, but that's no excuse for counterproductive behavior. Now, I would say that locking down business is the very definition of countering productivity. But to oppose lockdowns, to stand up and say, we don't want this, that is deemed counterproductive in today's political climate. And where's the pushback? Where's the rebellion? I know we'll be hearing at this conference from Derek Sloan, who I'm sure will have a lot to say about the way that caucuses manage positions and opinions and perspectives and all of these things. And I look forward to hearing that. But if there were a base of conservatives that were saying to a conservative leader who goes down that road, this is not what we signed up for, all of a sudden you're going to find that they have no choice but to start listening to the base. Or risk the consequences politically of not doing it. You can't force someone to act. You can't force someone to do the right thing, but you can put a penalty in place if they do the wrong thing. And one thing that Albertans know very well, particularly Albertan conservatives, is the importance of not sticking with the status quo if the status quo isn't working for you. I will say it is very difficult to get applause lines when you have reduced capacity social distance gatherings. So I do appreciate the one. I said to be bold and take a stand. So applauding me is about as bold as it can get. So I appreciate that very much. But it's difficult. It's difficult. We know that splintering parties is not a guarantee of success. We know it takes time. It takes a lot of money. It takes political capital, which is why it's important to focus on the people. Don't just focus on the elections, focus on changing hearts and minds. And that's one thing that the left has always done very well, is play at emotions. I'll tell you about a project I'm working on that I actually started this past week, a documentary about gun owners in Canada. And I'm a gun owner myself. I've seen firsthand how difficult it is under Justin Trudeau's premiership to be a gun owner in Canada. And I wanted to set out to talk about Justin Trudeau's war on guns. And there is a war on guns, believe it or not. I think you probably believe it. But as we were developing the project and figuring out who it is that we wanted to talk to and how best to structure it, there was something that kind of tweaked in my mind. And I don't even know when it was. But I said, you know what? This is not a war on guns. This is a war on people who own guns. And I decided, let's start telling stories the way the left does. Talk about the people. Talk about the people. So in the last week, I've interviewed business owners whose entire livelihood is in jeopardy because they might not be able to sell what they've already been able to sell, what they've always been able to sell. Competition sport shooters who might not even legally be allowed to represent Canada in the Olympics like they have for years, because they might not legally be allowed to have the guns that they use in competitions in their homes. And that's what I'm doing. I'm putting a human face on these stories. And that would be my recommendation to those seeking independence in Alberta. We care about freedom. We care about liberty. We care about government spending. We care about getting a good deal in policing, in an Alberta pension plan. We care about all of these things. Don't deal in abstractions, though. Talk about the people. Talk about the effect on individuals, the effect on taxpayers, the effect on business owners. And as we see the tide turning on the lockdown debate, that's how it's happening. It's not by talking about, oh, well, this rate of infection and this economic growth and the GDP going here. It's by talking about the person who came to Canada from Syria, built a business that now has to be closed. It's about the family who has no idea how their child is going to survive because they haven't been able to see their friends in years. A 6-year-old will probably spend a third of their life in lockdown. Just keep that in mind. Focus on the people. And that is the way you start changing the culture, when people start understanding how it affects them. Not everyone is going to be where you are on these issues. If they were, they'd already be on side. Elections are not won and lost by the people who vote Conservative every election, the people who vote Liberal every election, the people who vote NDP. They're won and lost by the people who only vote if they have a reason to, and the people who are genuinely undecided. Now, having been a candidate, I can tell you that undecided voters are very frustrating to political people, because I wait for elections. I look forward to them. When I was knocking on doors as a candidate, it was June 8th was the election, I think. Or you'd think I'd know this. June 8th, I think. And I was knocking on doors on June 7th. And so I said, oh, is there an election coming up? And I look down the street and see, 97 signs or something. And I say, well, yes, those aren't all just like the painters that are working at your neighbor's houses. I think they thought Andrew Lawton was like the most in-demand home contractor. One person I talked to, upper middle class neighborhood, educated, smart, kind, friendly woman. I had said to her, what do you care about? And she said, well, government spending, taxes, all that sort of stuff. And I said, okay, well, this is great. This is a vote for me. Let me tell you what I'm going to do if I get elected. And then she said, well, I got to tell you, I love that the NDP is promising free dental care. You already understand where this is going. And then I said to her, okay, well, that's great. I can understand that. I understand dental care is expensive. Not everyone has benefits. Who's going to pay for it, though? I kid you not. Her response, I never thought of that. Now, this was not me using really significantly good powers of persuasion here. This was what I thought was the most obvious fundamental question when any government is ever trying to spend anything. Who's going to pay for it? And that hadn't actually crossed the radar. And this actually was an eye-opening experience that came far too late in the campaign for me, which is that a lot of people don't have the time or energy or effort in the world in which we live to delve into the issues in the depth that we do. And this is why in sales, they tell people, you have to tell it in 30 seconds. I get story pitches all the time from people. And a lot of them, I've attached, 97 pages as PDF about, this study and that study and this study. And I said, yeah, I'll read through that. But if you want anyone to pay attention to the story, you've got to tell them in a couple of paragraphs, what is it? And more importantly, why does it matter? And when we talk about issues like freedom and issues like independence, we all view those things as inherently good. And any policy that threatens or harms those is therefore bad. If you're talking to someone who doesn't have that as their baseline position, either because they haven't thought of it or maybe because they've been raised in a culture that doesn't value freedom first and foremost, you're not going to get through to them by just saying, well, it's bad because it's against this. You have to talk about the effect it's going to have on their lives. And the way you do that, I talked about one, independent media. I talked about another, though, which is something that every single person in this room can do, and I would suspect a lot of people in this room probably do it. And more importantly, the people watching in. I hope you are doing this, which is not being afraid to say to the people in your life, this is what I believe. There's something called cancellation in the cancel culture that we know of. One of the most insidious effects of cancel culture has been the self-cancellation that is now ubiquitous, wherein people preemptively cancel themselves because they think, well, someone's going to cancel me down the road, so why don't I just do it now while I'm in control of it? This week, there was actually a significant story in this, where a publisher of hate speech, the Dr. Seuss Family Trust, decided that it was going to take 6 of its 60-plus titles out of circulation. Now, I'm a believer in intellectual property rights. They're the property right owner. They're the copyright owner. They don't want it. That's fine. They have the right to do that. But I can't help but to look and say that this seems to be coming from a fear of the culture rather than a genuine introspection. Because we have seen libraries and schools and other groups that have said, well, we don't want this book, we don't want that book, we don't want to do all of this. And you know what? That's going to happen more and more. So companies and individuals and groups are finding that they want to retreat because they don't want to deal with the stakes. And I get that. No one wants to find themselves on the wrong end of the cancel mob. No one wants to find themselves being said that you're this name and that name, but that's going to happen regardless in a lot of cases. So take a stand and you will be surprised. I can guarantee you will be surprised at how many other people are probably there with you, but are too afraid to say it. I will close along that vein with this. Whether we're talking about independence, whether we're talking about firearms, whether we're talking about lockdowns, whether we're talking about taxes, whether we're talking about Cambodian rice tariffs, it's a very big issue. I don't know if it is. Tom would know. He's laughing. Tom, that must have been a good joke then. Whether you're talking about any issue under the sun, there is a constituency for that issue. And then there is the mainstream media, which has its own constituency. Always understand that you are going to be more in tune with what real people think as real people than the media and political elites who are telling you what you're supposed to think. And the second that people start to overwhelm them, and not with force, but with force of opinion, the second people start to overwhelm them is when they have to either reevaluate, which is the best case scenario, or at the very least lose their legitimacy. Mainstream media trust is on the decline. The reason is because people have ways now to speak up that show, well, hang on, the mainstream media says no one thinks this, but you know what? 90% of my Facebook friends do think this. So have I just found like the only people in the world that do believe this, or are they wrong? And I think you'll find they're just wrong. Thank you.